Documentary about intellectual property can be seen on our C-SPAN website. Thanks so much and congratulations, Carl.
Thank you for having me.
We'll now go to the floor of the House of Representatives, who are getting down to work. Thanks so much for joining us today. That's all for Washington Journal.
The chair lays before the House a communication from the Speaker.
The Speaker's Rooms, Washington, D.C., April 26, 2012. I hereby appoint the Honorable Bill Flores to act as Speaker pro tempore on this day. Signed, John A. Boehner, Speaker of the House of Representatives.
Pursuant to the order of the House of January 17, 2012, the Chair will now recognize members from lists submitted by the majority and minority leaders for morning hour debate. The Chair will alternate recognition between the parties, with each party limited to 1 hour, and each member other than the majority and the minority leaders and the minority whip limited to 5 minutes each, but in no event shall debate continue beyond 11:50 a.m. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With the unfortunate Arizona state immigration law under review by the Supreme Court, it's an appropriate time to take a step back and look at the big picture. Mexico is exhibiting some of the demographic changes taking place around the world that are exhibited in the most extreme forms in places like Japan and Italy, where birth rates are falling, the population is aging, and dramatic stress is placed upon their economy. It's not yet to that point in Mexico, but the game has definitely changed. In contrast, the United States, which has had a growing and vibrant population, in no small measure because we've been energized from people from around the world. It's time to consider our immigration policies and practices for the future. Even though there's been no more contentious issue in American politics than that of immigration, the situation surrounding Mexican immigration has changed profoundly. As I mentioned, the birth rate is falling, and for the first time, as many people are leaving the United States for Mexico as who are arriving from Mexico in the United States. Illegal entry is clearly declining. The number of arrests at the border demonstrates that. The number of people being deported in greater numbers than ever before. It's not that there isn't still a problem. There are still some bad actors coming across the border, no mistake about it. But there are important opportunities to concentrate on what's important. People who are dealing with drugs, security threats, criminals, wasting resources on a scattershot effort on people who are here just to work or to be with their families is not particularly a wise use of resources, and it doesn't make us any safer. It's past time to deal with the millions of people who are already here and part of the fabric of our communities. Often, they are with families that include children who are citizens and other family members who are citizens as part of an extended family. And it's not just the members of those extended families that rely on one another. America relies on these millions of people. As the Alabama legislature found out, with draconian efforts to try and deal with illegal immigrants and legal immigrants, by the way, it ended up almost ruining a number of their farmers, and they had to backtrack. Immigrants have always been a source of America's strength. Our current policies inflict damage to the realities of those family ties, especially to children who are already citizens. But we do other dumb things. We deny smart people who are educated at great expense at some of the finest institutions in America with important skills that would be valuable to business. We make it hard for them to be there. Unfortunately, if their skills are going to be utilized, too often they end up being hired by foreign overseas competitors, or American companies have to create jobs for them overseas. There are a half dozen pieces of legislation in a piecemeal fashion that will make it better. One of the most important is the DREAM Act, which would allow children who were brought here at an early age to be able to earn the right to citizenship if they've done work in education or perform work in the military. I'm pleased to see support for all of these different pieces of legislation that would bring a measure of rationality and fairness gaining support. But the most important thing we can do is to return to that spirit of bipartisan cooperation that was exhibited by the late Ted Kennedy and by the way John McCain used to be before he ran for re-election in today's Arizona, because they were sponsoring comprehensive immigration reform. They didn't rely on a half dozen pieces of legislation, but really looked at the problem holistically for the people involved, for the community, and for the country. To have a thoughtful path to citizenship that people could earn, not being granted amnesty, but by paying taxes, learning the language, demonstrating a clear commitment to what it takes to be a constructive part of the community. Comprehensive immigration reform is what ultimately will help us unwind this problem, save money and heartache, and get about the business of building a stronger American future for all our families. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chairman recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I come to the floor again, as I've had the past 2 years, to talk about the location of high-level nuclear waste around this country and compare and contrast it with where we have high-level nuclear waste, mostly spent nuclear fuel, but other type of defined as waste, and compare it to where it should be based upon a 1982 law, the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, and the 1987 amendment to that law, which identified Yucca Mountain as the location where we should be storing high-level nuclear waste. So today, Today we go to Pennsylvania and West Virginia area, and we compare Yucca Mountain with a nuclear power plant called Limerick. So at Yucca Mountain, currently there is no nuclear waste on site. In Limerick, there is 1,143 metric tons uranium, spent nuclear fuel on the site. At Yucca Mountain, the waste would be stored, if it's there, 1,000 feet underground. At Limerick, you can see waste is stored above ground in pools and casts. That's above ground. If it was stored in Yucca Mountain, it would be 1,000 feet above the water table. Why is that? Well, Yucca Mountain's in a desert. So that's why the water table is very, very low. Well, at Limerick, the waste is stored 20 feet above the groundwater. Finally, at Yucca Mountain's 100 miles from the Colorado River. Limerick is on the Schuylkill River, 40 miles from Philadelphia. Now, Yucca is about 100 miles from Las Vegas, Nevada. And the importance of this is just to address with Fukushima Daiichi and nuclear waste and some difficulties we've had, and public policy being as is defined by law. The question is, why do we still have nuclear waste in Pennsylvania right outside Philadelphia, and why don't we have it underneath a mountain in a desert? And the answer is, I know it would shock people, politics here in Washington, especially in the other chamber, not complying with the law, along with an administration that is in league with those who have blocked the final scientific study for Yucca Mountain. So what I've been doing is going around and look at the senators from the states around the nuclear power plants that I've been addressing, and where do they stand individually? Well, Senator Casey, relatively new senator, has really been silent on that. Although he has said, as a senator from the state with 9 commercial reactors and 10 million people living within 50 miles of those reactors, I can tell you that nuclear security is extremely important to Pennsylvanians. Obviously, the nuclear waste is not that important to him, since he's been silent on Yucca Mountain. Senator Toomey is quoted as saying, the alternative is what we have now, highly radioactive waste located at 131 sites in 39 states, including nuclear power plants close to the Lehigh Valley. That cannot be as safe and secure as burying this stuff deep in Yucca Mountain. I would agree with the senator. Senator Manchin from West Virginia, relatively new, been silent on what we should do with the high-level nuclear waste, and part of this process is to identify that and hopefully have him come out in a statement. Senator Rockefeller voted no, and he has his statement is nuclear energy is touted by his proponents as carbon-free option that should have its share of the nation's electricity generation expanded. Yet we have never figured out what to do about the permanent storage and human health and safety concerns regarding high radioactive waste with a half-life measured in tens of thousands of years. And that's where I very much disagree with the senator, because the federal government has spent 20 years and $9 billion studying Yucca Mountain. Unprecedented 100 million year projections were completed showing Yucca's safety. There is no safer place in the entire United States for nuclear waste than Yucca Mountain. So then I've been doing a tally across the country of the senators and where they stand as of today. We have 48 who support Yucca Mountain and high-level nuclear waste. 18, we don't know. Hopefully, well, they'll get a chance to cast a vote. 20 who are no. In the filibuster world that operates in the other chamber, you know, we really need 60. We're very close. In fact, if 12 of these 18 undecideds are yes, there should be no reason why we would allow Senator Reid and the President of the United States to block further development and movement to take all our high-level nuclear waste, store it safely in a mountain, in a desert. And I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, for 5 minutes. The gentlelady is without objection.
Yesterday, the guest chaplain asked that the House of Representatives be blessed and that each member of the House of Representatives be blessed. And in our opportunity to be free in our expression of religion, I ask that each of us bless this nation. For that reason, I set this morning to discuss just a series of issues, hoping that we can improve the quality of life of not only Americans, but people around the world. First, we have to clean up our house. And so I express outrage of the actions of 2 former TSA workers, TSO officers, and 2 present TSO officers. All of us can fall short because we are human. But the outrage of participating in drug trafficking right here in the United States as an official of the United States government should be condemned by all of us. And I will call for immediate hearings to ensure that the culture of TSO officers, besides their frontline duty, is to respect the job and the task. As a champion of their work, believing that their work is extremely vital to the security of this nation and the fact that we have not been attacked on our soil since 9/11, I call for immediate investigation and response. This morning as well, we determined that the Secret Service, who finished quickly an investigation of the Colombian debacle dealing with sex workers, prostitutes, now have discovered through a contractor that, in fact, actions occurred in El Salvador. We thought it might not be the culture, but let's own up and begin as necessary to purge those who are reckless in their behavior. Thank you to the men and women of the Secret Service who've always done their duty, but to the dastardly deeds of those who think it's a playground, get out now. There is no tolerance for this kind of behavior. Let me move immediately to the work in Syria. I was the first member to go to the Syrian embassy to ask for the fall or the removal of Dr. Assad, and we have been moving along while others have been slaughtered, meaning discussions at the UN National Security Council, a special envoy, do this, do that. While women and children are being slaughtered, it is time for there to be a stronger statement on the removal of Dr. Assad and the increase in UN peacekeepers. The people need your help in Syria. The bloodshed continues. The fear is insurmountable almost. It is necessary on behalf of the human rights to be able to move quickly in Syria. As the Supreme Court has discussed the Arizona law, I hope that we can bless America by having comprehensive immigration reform. I hope we can understand that there are laws that work well. Just helping a Korean student who was shot in my jurisdiction, whose father was denied entry because of his language and didn't understand. He now has been granted humanitarian parole. Let's have comprehensive immigration reform so that we don't have states who are stopping families who are U.S. citizens in the streets of Arizona, profiling them because of this dastardly law, that we don't have police officers having to become immigration officers while they need to be rescuing people and saving people. Let's do the decent thing. Let's bless America and have comprehensive immigration reform. And then, of course, the Senate is debating the issue of the Violence Against Women Act, an act that as a new member of Congress, I had the pleasure of both co-sponsoring, writing amendments as a member of the House Judiciary Committee, and it is sad that we have a divide on the Violence Against Women Act that has bipartisan support, the Leahy bill. This House should take that bill up immediately as it passed the Senate. Do you realize how many women are being killed a day, an hour, because of the domestic violence that this particular act helps to outreach and provide resources and counseling and opportunities to be able to nurture those women and to be able to ensure that they are safe. As a former board member of the Houston Area Women's Center that has been a living example of protecting women against dastardly violence and, of course, men who are subjected to domestic violence, it is, unfortunately, a form of an epidemic in this country, as we have seen bullying. We have to be able to bless America and have people turn internally. Let them seek help. But why stall the passage of the Violence Against Women Act, which in fact will provide the nurture and comfort and resources and the national statement that we abhor and stand against violence against women and others who will be impacted violently in this nation. As a member who stood along Chairman Hyde some many years ago, the late Chairman Hyde, the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, a Republican, who stood alongside of us to say he stands with legislation to protect women, get the Senate to do its business, and let the House do its business. Let us bless America. I yield back.
The gentlelady from Tennessee is recognized, Ms. Blackburn, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to offer my praise to one of Tennessee's true living legends. Born in Clarksville, Tennessee, in Tennessee's 7th Congressional District, Coach Pat Head Summitt paved the way for women athletes at Cheatham County High School and then at the University of Tennessee, Martin. She was an exemplary student athlete, and today the gym at UT Martin is named in her honor. She took the reins at the University of Tennessee in 1974, and she has led the Lady Vols to an unprecedented 31 consecutive NCAA tournament appearances. In her time as a coach, she has coached 12 Olympians, 20 Kodak All-Americans, and 77 All-SEC performers. After 1,098 career wins over 38 seasons, Pat Head Summitt is the all-time winningest coach in NCAA basketball history. Pushing excellence both on and off the court, Coach Summitt prepared her players to be successful women when they hang up their jerseys. We will remember her legacy at UT for two things: winning games and, most importantly, graduating players. Every lady volunteer who finished their eligibility at the University of Tennessee graduated from college. That is a statistic to cheer about. Coach Summitt has dedicated her career and her magnificent journey to the great game of women's basketball and to the student athletes she's championed. This week, we have welcomed Coach Summitt and her son Tyler. They've been here in D.C. with us this week as we have saluted her career and as we cheer her as she now coaches millions of volunteers in fighting Alzheimer's and early onset dementia. Thank you, Coach Summitt, for leading by example both on and off the court. Yield back.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Hoyer, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ladies and gentlemen of the House, 64 years ago, the State of Israel was born out of the hope of a generation and on the heels of history's darkest human tragedy. Notwithstanding the many grave challenges that have faced since that day, still in our time, Israel has achieved a thriving economy, a strong national defense, and an important role as a member of the family of nations. Israel's existence itself is a powerful symbol of the Jewish people's resolve never again to permit its sons and daughters to face the threat of persecution or of genocide. On my many visits to Israel, I have witnessed the triumph of a dream, a beautiful dream, that sustained the Jewish people for 2,000 years, and that has been fulfilled through the blossoming of a desert, the emergence of Israel's high-tech economy, and the freedoms of speech, press, and religions for its citizens of every faith. Israel continues to impress the world with their achievements in business, technology, sports, the arts, and the defense of human rights. They are even more remarkable when considering the very real dangers Israel faces in the form of terrorism, regional instability, and the threat from Iran. For Americans, Israel's peace and security has always been an important interest of the national interest of the United States of America. As President Obama has made very clear, our countries will continue to work closely together to prevent a nuclear-armed Iran. Not only do the United States and Israel share common interest, we also share common values: democracy, equal opportunity, human rights, and a yearning for peace, and the ideals we hold in our hearts. And together we have worked for 64 years to defend them and promote them. On the anniversary of Israel's independence, Americans continue to stand side by side with Israel as it pursues peace and security for its people and, yes, for its region. I pray for the peace of Israel and its people and for all the people of that troubled region. And I know the strong bonds between our nations will endure for generations to come. Those futures were what we worked so hard to make possible for thousands and thousands. Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Dole, for 5 minutes. Without objection, the gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In March, the United States recognized 10 women who were risking their lives to bring about justice in their countries. These women were honored in the United States as the 2012 International Women of Courage and visited Congress to share their stories and give a voice to the people of their countries who have nowhere else to turn. I had the privilege of meeting with each of these women and listening to their stories and learn more about their fight to end human rights abuses and to make the world a better place. I was impressed with their strength, their courage, and want to share some of their stories with you here today so that we can continue to speak up for those who have no voice. Maryam Durrani is from Afghanistan. At age 27, she is the director of a women's association for culture and speaks out for the rights of women and girls in Kandahar province. Her life has been threatened numerous times, and yet she continues to fight for women in Afghanistan and has started the only female-focused radio station in the nation. She received the International Women of Courage Award for striving to give a voice to women through the power of media, government, and civil society. Priscila del Oliveira Azevedo is from Brazil. She's 34 and serves as the General Coordinator for Strategic Programs for the Rio de Janeiro State Secretariat of Public Security. She's one of the most senior officers in the police pacification units in her country and has worked to end drug dealing operations in Brazil. She arrested a gang of criminals who had once kidnapped her and is working with the state and local governments to improve conditions throughout Brazil. She received this award for integrating previously marginalized populations into the larger Rio de Janeiro community. Zinmar Ong from Burma at age 36, is a Democratic activist who was a former political prisoner and was held for 11 years because of her efforts to promote democracy, women's empowerment, and conflict resolution in Burma. She received this award for championing democracy, strengthening civil society, and empowering individuals to contribute meaningfully to the political transformation of Burma. Janeth Beoa Lima is from Colombia and at age 38 is an investigative journalist. While on assignment, she was repeatedly raped and left in a dumpster. She was left in this dumpster by her attackers and told that they were sending a message to the Colombian press. Since that horrific attack, she has spoken out against sexual violence and become a role model for women in Colombia. She was given this award for her unfailing courage, determination, and perseverance fighting for justice all around the globe. Hannah El-Habisi is a 27-year-old architect from Libya who contributed to the proper documentation of the violence during the revolution in her country. She also is an advocate for women's rights in her country and received this award for courageous advancement of the cause of freedom of expression and promotion of women's rights during the time of conflict and transition in Libya. Anessa Alamed is from Maldives and founded Hope for Women. She advocates for ending gender-based violence in Maldives and has served as the Deputy Minister of Women's Affairs. She received this award for courageous advocacy of women's rights and protection of domestic violence. Shahad Begum is 33 and is from Pakistan, who is a courageous human rights activist. She provides political training, microcredit information, and more to women in her country. There have been numerous attempts to end her life, but she remains committed to advancing women's rights and even won a local office in her country. She received this award for fearlessly championing Pakistani women's political and economic rights. Samar Baldawi is from Saudi Arabia and at 31 monitors human rights in her country. She is the first woman in Saudi Arabia to file a lawsuit against the government demanding that women have a right to vote. She won this award for demonstrating significant courage in her activism while becoming a champion in the struggle for women's suffrage and legal rights in Saudi Arabia. Hawa Abdullah Mohammed Salih is from Sudan and is a human rights activist forced to flee Darfur. She lived in an internally displaced persons camp and has since spoken out about human rights abuses in these very camps and has advocated for women's rights in her country. She has been persecuted by the government of Sudan and forced to flee her country and received this award for giving a voice to the women and children of Darfur. Mr. Speaker, I wanted to simply say that these women act as a role model for all women across the country, across the world, and we must stand up for women's rights. And I yield back.
Time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Woolsey, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, last weekend the United States government and Afghanistan reached a strategic agreement to define the terms of the relationship between our two countries in the near-term future. First of all, this agreement affirms that our combat troops will not leave Afghanistan until 2014, which is far too slow a timetable. Don't we have enough evidence right here, after 10-plus years, that we're not making America safer with this war. We're not minimizing the terrorist threat, and we're not bringing stability and security to Afghanistan. How much more will Americans be asked to sacrifice? How many more tens of billions in taxpayer dollars will be wasted when we have so many needs right here at home? How many more Americans have to come home in a casket? How many more will take their own lives because the mental health distress of serving in a combat zone becomes too much? How many more have to spend the rest of their lives in a wheelchair or without a limb or limbs because of injuries suffered in an immoral and unnecessary war? Believe me, Mr. Speaker, there is not a minute to waste. Now is the moment to end this war and bring our troops home. The meeting this weekend does, however, show the importance of a plan going forward, a plan that will define the terms of our engagement with Afghanistan after the war is over. I've always said that ending the military occupation does not mean abandoning Afghanistan. The question is, what form will our partnership take? And on that question, the agreement signed this weekend provides very little guidance. According to the Washington Post, in fact, and I'll quote them, they say the specifics of the U.S. commitment to Afghanistan have yet to be formally outlined. Then the Post adds that the document provides only a vaguely worded reassurance, leaving many to guess at what the U.S. commitment means in practice, unquote. Well, Mr. Speaker, we need more than a guess. We need a clear strategy for investing in Afghanistan and its people. And while a lot of the talk has been about continuing to shore up Afghan security forces, we need a much more comprehensive approach. In short, we need to implement smart security, the strategy that I've spoken of from this spot hundreds of times since 2004. Smart security would replace our military surge with a civilian surge. It would put humanitarian aid in front and center. It would emphasize development and diplomacy instead of invasion and occupation. It would mean in place of troops and weapons, we send experts with tools and resources to rebuild Afghan infrastructure, hospitals, and schools. It would mean investing in programs to improve maternal health and child mortality. It would mean a focus on democracy promotion and rebuilding civil society in Afghanistan. It would also mean shifting the emphasis to peace building, conflict prevention, and human rights education. This approach would save lives. It would promote peace. It is a superior counterterrorism and national security strategy. It will keep the American people safe. It will advance our values in a way that a decade of war clearly has not. We can't wait until 2014, Mr. Speaker. We need a smart security approach in Afghanistan, and we need it now. And we need to start by bringing our troops home. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Duncan, for 5 minutes. Without objection, the gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in honor of our country's veterans, and I want to begin briefly by mentioning an organization that helps veterans that was recently brought to my attention. Patriot Outreach, a nonprofit organization to assist our military with getting the help they need to deal with the trauma associated with aspects of military service. You can learn more about that at patriotoutreach.org, and I think they're doing a great service for our veterans. Benjamin Disraeli once said that the legacy of heroes is the memory of a great name and the inheritance of a great example. In our country, some of our greatest heroes are our veterans, individuals who answered our nation's call to protect and defend our freedom. Our veterans are one of our nation's greatest treasures, and as such, our country has given them a firm promise. Because of their willingness to protect us through their service, when their service ends, we promise to take care of them. But unfortunately, if you talk to veterans today, they don't believe that our government is living up to their promises. When we made the commitment to take care of our troops when they returned home, we never said anything about making them jump through hoops or navigate a complicated bureaucracy. We promised our veterans the moon and instead have failed in many instances to provide them with the most basic of care. As of March 16th this year, the Columbia, South Carolina Regional Office of the Veterans Administration had over 21,927 pending cases with an average wait time of 232 days. Survivor benefits for veteran spouses can take between 10 and 18 months to be dispersed, and sometimes even longer depending on the health status of the beneficiary. My office is currently assisting a constituent who contacted us because he has had 12 claims pending before the VA, which date all the way back to 2004.
Another constituent has had her claims delayed over 18 months because she's been told by the VA that they don't have her medical records. Now, this is despite the fact that she's already sent the VA her medical records twice by certified mail. Unfortunately, claims aren't the only backlog facing the VA. Veterans are also forcing delays in seeking medical attention. A lack of doctors and inefficiency in the system has forced some veterans to have to wait months to receive medical care. Mr. Speaker, to put it simply, the VA isn't clicking and ticking. Despite the best intentions of VA personnel to deliver a high level of service and care to our veterans, too many of our former servicemen and women are falling through the cracks. In the 3rd District of South Carolina, we recently created an advisory committee composed of retired military veterans to provide insight into some of the problems that they're facing today. Their view is not that the law needs to be changed necessarily, but that the spirit of law is not being followed. Veterans were promised certain benefits, and in too many cases, they are still waiting to receive them. In addition to the mounting pile of problems regarding veteran services, I am deeply concerned that veterans will be negatively impacted by the implementation of Obamacare. The clear goal of the Obama administration's unconditional and unconstitutional health care law is to begin lumping our servicemen and women into the bureaucracy of Obamacare. Not only do I think that this breaks a promise made to our veterans, but I'm afraid it will make an already bad situation worse. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, we can do better. And for the sake of our living heroes, we must do better. Let us not forget the promises that we made to our veterans. And let us not just honor our veterans with our words, but let's also honor them with our actions. Thank you. May God bless our troops in the field, those here at home. May God bless those who have served our country in uniform. And may God continue to bless the United States of America. And I yield back.
Back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today I rise to talk about the discriminatory voter ID laws that are undemocratic and simply un-American. The American Legislative Exchange Council, also known as ALEC, has long been a secretive collaboration between big business and conservative Tea Party Republican politicians serving in this nation's state and federal legislatures. ALEC's goal is to advance the special interests of large corporations and the super rich and the wealthy by any means necessary. Yesterday, I discussed how ALEC has fiendishly and unabashedly produced legislative policy that degrades our air and water quality and wrecks our environment. Last week, I outlined how ALEC has infiltrated our criminal justice system by producing legislation that stimulates higher and higher levels of incarceration to the benefit and to the surging profits of the private for-profit prison industry. And if that wasn't enough, with 194 days left until the general election, ALEC has been working hard to suppress the votes of the most vulnerable in our society. ALEC has met with its corporate allies and right-wing state officials behind closed doors to promote legislation to suppress the votes of likely Democratic voters. By making it more difficult for people to exercise their rights to vote, ALEC's Model Voter ID Act grants an electoral advantage to Republicans while undermining the right of individuals to vote. In addition, ALEC has worked to make it easier for corporations to participate in the political process. Their Public Safety and Elections Task Force promotes model legislation that would disenfranchise millions of voters, devastate campaign finance reform, and allow for greater corporate influence in elections. Mr. Speaker, it has injected these corrosive laws into our states and they have spread like untreated cancer. Bills based on ALEC's model legislation have already been introduced in 34 states and passed in many of those states. Voter suppression comes in many forms, from new voter ID laws to eliminating election day registration, to voting or to restricting voter registration drives by community groups, to reducing the number of days for early voting and limiting the number of days for voter registration. There is no doubt that ALEC is directly tied to the proliferation of these voter ID laws in the state's legislatures. These policies are not about preventing fraud in the voting process. This legislation is solely about disenfranchising minorities, the elderly, and other at-risk voters, such as the poor, who are unlikely to have the technical kinds of ID that these pieces of legislation demand. So now, ALEC has, after the spotlight has started to shine on ALEC, they have come out publicly and said, okay, we're going to get out of the public policy business. They're going to not write any more model legislation like the Florida shoot first and ask kill, or shoot first and ask questions later. They're not going to introduce any more of that type of legislation. And they also have announced that they're going to shut down their Public Safety and Elections Task Force, which is the committee that produced the voter suppression legislation. That's a good thing, but the damage has already been done, and we're going to have to remain vigilant about this group, this shadowy group, ALEC, this unholy alliance between Tea Party Republican legislators and big business. We'll have to keep our eyes on it. I'll have more to talk about ALEC in the coming days, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Speaker, I've come to the floor this morning with great sadness, but with also a great sense of pride to honor the service of a Georgia hero, Private First Class Jonathan Frank Davis. On March the 29th, 2012, Jonathan gave the ultimate sacrifice in Kandahar province of Afghanistan while supporting Operation Enduring Freedom. Jonathan was the son of Reverend and Mrs. Carrie Davis of Griffin, Georgia. His mother, Tracy, described him as tender-hearted, a tenderness that extended to both his peers and animals. His heart was so large that they now have numerous pets running around their home due to Jonathan not being able to turn away a single stray. His nurturing and giving nature was one of the things that was loved most about him. As a child, Jonathan always stood up for his classmates who were being bullied, and many of Jonathan's peers remembers that he was the first to come to their defense. He was willing to give his shirt off his back to help others and was always concerned about the well-being of everyone around him, especially those less fortunate. Jonathan was playful and strove to make others happy, either by playing funny pranks on them or with his unforgettable smile that could light up a room. Jonathan attended Griffin High School, where he played soccer, and after graduation, he, like myself, married his high school sweetheart. Her name is Kristen. Kristen is expecting their first child, and Jonathan talked all the time of how excited he was to become a father. He carried the sonogram of baby Benjamin in his wallet everywhere he went and couldn't wait to teach their baby boy soccer. Jonathan's unwavering courage, huge heart, and strong Christian faith are the reasons why he answered his calling to join the Army. He was assigned to the 4th Squadron, 73rd Cavalry Regiment, 4th Brigade Combat Team of the 82nd Airborne Division at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. He was pursuing a medical career after the Army and have already completed part of his EMT and paramedic training was on the path to attending medical school. Jonathan was part of a scout group, sweeping an area in Afghanistan and doing what he does best, protecting others, when his group came under enemy fire and he suffered fatal wounds. At only age 20, Jonathan was taken from us much too soon. On April the 7th, the First Assembly of God's Church in Griffin, Georgia, celebrated the life of Jonathan, and he was laid to rest by his close family and friends. I am proud to stand before you and honor the life of PFC Jonathan Davis and thank him for his dedicated service to our country. His endless generosity and brave spirit are among the many reasons he will be missed so much by all who had the privilege to know him. Joni and I extend our deepest sympathy to the friends and family of Jonathan, and we will never forget his great sacrifice for our nation and those that allows us to live free every day. Jonathan, till we meet again someday, thank you, brother. And I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Spear, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise again for the 19th time to highlight the epidemic of rape and sexual assault in the military. By the military's own figures, 19,000 sexual assaults and rapes occur each year, but only 13% of the members of the military actually report them. Last week, I met with Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta, along with my colleagues, to discuss DoD's new report of data on rape and sexual assault in the military. The report shows a slight increase in reports of rape and assault, but a startling decrease in the number of charges brought against reported perpetrators. With the decrease in charges came a significant decrease in prosecutions, in punishments, and in convictions. The numbers, frankly, are very discouraging. When I left the meeting, I was only pleased about one thing. Secretary Panetta and I agree that the only way to solve this problem is with an increase in prosecutions. We agree on the result to be achieved, but for right now, we do not agree on the steps to achieve it. After our meeting, Secretary Panetta announced new initiatives, but DoD's 3 major proposals will not increase prosecutions, convictions, or punishments. Proposal 1, elevate cases of rape and sexual assault to higher-ranking officials in the chain of command. Military commanders today told me that many are already having them handled by colonels and captains, yet this does not result in more prosecutions. I believe the cases have to be handled by an impartial office within the military, but outside the chain of command. Proposal number 2, establish a special victims unit in each service of the military. These units have been in place in the Army since 2009. I'm impressed with the training program that is offered to the various members of the investigation and prosecution within the Army. But again, we have not seen an increase in prosecutions, convictions, or punishments as of yet. Proposal 3, create a centralized database of these proceedings and cases. This is a good thing. It's already required in the Department of Defense as a result of the NDAA 2009. So for all intents and purposes, all of these initiatives are already in place to some extent. What the problem is the chain of command, and let me explain. Claudia Castillo, an Army corporal, whose attempts for justice back in 2003 and 2004 were thwarted repeatedly by commanding officers, including a high-ranking lieutenant colonel, all of whom were unmoved by her reports of sexual assault and harassment. Corporal Castillo was on combat deployment in Iraq when she awoke to a fellow specialist on top of her, sexually assaulting her and using force. She was in shock and screamed until he left. She immediately reported the assault to her platoon sergeant, who responded with a lack of surprise or concern. He advised her to wait while he, quote, looked into it, unquote. He did not have any advice for how she could get help or go forward. Corporal Castillo also encountered several incidents of harassment, stalking, and erratic behavior by a much older staff sergeant. She would wake up to find him standing by her bed while she slept. Her reports to command were greeted with ridicule and not taken seriously. Command discretion empowers the commander to decide if a case goes forward to a court-martial. Even if very high-ranking commanders are in charge of these cases, captains and colonels are not shielded from the conflict of interest that exists in the chain of command. Victims should have the benefit of impartiality by objective experts, which is why my bill, H.R. 3435, attempts to do that. We need to overhaul the current military justice system, and I will continue to tell stories like Corporal Castillo's until military justice means justice for all. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Olson, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I ask the assistant to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to recognize Dee Cook, a distinguished leader in my home community of Fort Bend County, Texas. For over 40 years, Dee has given her time and her energy to helping the children of Fort Bend County, in part through her commitment and support of Child Advocates of Fort Bend County, which fights on behalf of abused and neglected children. Dee has served as the grant officer of the George Foundation since 1988. The George Foundation contributes to many worthy causes throughout Fort Bend County, and Dee has played a pivotal role in making sure the generosity of the foundation is directed to causes that help our communities the most. However, it is her generous contributions through the George Foundation to Child Advocates of Fort Bend County that bring me to the floor today. By contributing her time, energy, and resources, Dee has enabled Child Advocates to serve over 8,000 children throughout Fort Bend County. Under her leadership, Dee Cook has helped teach the staff and volunteers to be better leaders, more effective program managers, and to achieve the dream of helping the most vulnerable children in our communities in ways we never thought possible 20 years ago. Her contributions are helping children, and in turn, strengthening our communities and neighborhoods. She's giving a voice to those who desperately need one on their behalf. Dee's efforts to build philanthropic leaders doesn't stop with Child Advocates. She has also started an annual 8-month Leadership for Nonprofit Excellence course to teach the rising stars of Fort Bend County the skills they need to harness and grow Fort Bend's strong nonprofit community. Most importantly, she has led a cooperative effort between the George Foundation and the Sugar Land Chamber of Commerce to create the Youth in Philanthropy, the YIP team. The YIP team is 100 Fort Bend County high school juniors and seniors who spend a school year seeing how volunteerism and philanthropy coexist to serve our Fort Bend community. At the end of the school year, the YIP team will put their knowledge to the test by awarding monetary grants to nonprofits. Life-changing indeed. I commend Dee Cook for a lifetime of service to Fort Bend County. And simply want to say to Dee, on behalf of the people of Fort Bend County, thank you. Fort Bend County would not be the county that we all know and love without Dee Cook. And in closing, Dee's love for Fort Bend County will be on display tonight at Constellation Field as Fort Bend's new pro baseball team, the Sugar Land Skeeters, has their first home game. I join Dee and the people of Sugar Land and Fort Bend County in saying, "Go Skeeters!" I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair will receive a message.
Mr. Speaker, a message from the Senate.
Mr. Speaker,
Madam Secretary, sorry.
I've been directed by the Senate to inform the House that the Senate has passed S. 1789, an act to improve, sustain, and transform the United States Postal Service, in which the concurrence of the House is requested.
Okay. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Capps, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, We all know that if Congress doesn't come together soon, interest rates on student loans will double on July 1st. Rates will go from 3.4% to 6.8%. Right now in our country, student loan debt is higher than credit card debt. This is a huge challenge and a barrier facing students, their families, and our economy. We cannot have our graduates leaving school with crushing debt. It limits the careers they can pursue. And we certainly don't want young people shying away from continuing their education because they know they'll never be able to afford it. We must keep open the doors of opportunity for all, and in the process, produce a well-educated workforce that's going to grow our economy. But if Congress doesn't act soon, more than 7 million low and middle income students nationwide will be required to pay more for their student loans. This would mean adding thousands of dollars to a college bill. And that's why I'm a proud supporter of legislation to address this issue. I support ending some of the lavish subsidies we give to extraordinarily profitable oil companies and using that money to keep student loan rates from doubling, and at the same time reducing our deficit by billions of dollars. We must get our priorities straight. We should be investing in our students and bringing down our deficit, instead of handing over taxpayer dollars to some of the richest corporations in the world. I urge my colleagues to join in this effort, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Boustany, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I recently received the first monthly update from the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs since the announced delays associated with the Lafayette and Lake Charles VA community-based outpatient clinics. VA Secretary Eric Shinseki's office followed through on my request for detailed monthly updates of the progress the VA is making with regard to these clinics in both Lafayette and Lake Charles. The errors in the contracting process were solely the VA's fault, and they've admitted it. And I will remain vigilant in overseeing the expedited process to deliver South Louisiana veterans the local care they need and deserve. I'm pleased to announce that there are new and much-needed services for veterans coming to Lafayette in early May. These services include home-based primary care, imaging and x-ray services, prosthetics, and dental care. For the veterans in Lake Charles, a mobile clinic providing primary care services is expected to begin June 4th, and selection of a location is underway. This will be a first for our veterans in Lake Charles who've had to travel afar to get basic care. According to the VA officials, the Veterans Affairs Clinic primary care services will be available in Lake Charles 3 days per week, also beginning June 4th. Women's services will be provided 1 day per week in Lake Charles beginning as well. We need to do more, and we're going to do more. These are all very important services the veterans of South Louisiana deserve. After sacrificing so much for our country, they should not have to wait any longer for this very much needed medical care. Expediting this process must remain a top priority for the veterans for the VA. Having cared for veterans in the VA system during my medical career, I know localized, personalized outpatient facilities and care are best for our veterans. This is a critical priority for our area. This is the least we can do for those who fought for our country, on behalf of our country. And I'm committed to ensuring that this unnecessary VA mistake does not repeat itself in the future, and I will continue demanding accountability from the VA leadership on this and on other issues. I will continue to be the leading advocate for local veterans as we work to improve health care for our veterans in Lafayette and Lake Charles and the surrounding communities of South Louisiana. God bless those who have served our country. God bless America. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Wisconsin, Ms. Capps, for 5 minutes. Ms. Moore, excuse me.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I come humbly to the well today under the E pluribus unum to humbly ask that there be swift bipartisan action in reauthorizing the Violence Against Women's Act. VAWA's authorization, of course, lapsed at the end of the last fiscal year, September 30, 2011. And unfortunately, for every day that passes by, women pay the price. The annual National Census of Domestic Violence Services, a daily snapshot taken every year by the National Network to End Domestic Violence, found that in one 24-hour period in the United States, over 67,000 victims were served through emergency shelters, transitional housing, counseling, legal advocacy, and more. Over 22,000 hotline phone calls were answered, and over 26,000 people participated in domestic violence prevention and education trainings. But for all these people who are served, unfortunately, in the same 24-hour period, there are nearly 11,000 unmet requests for services because these programs neither have the resources to help these victims nor the authorizations based on best practices on how we need to change VAWA in order to meet the needs of women. Our colleagues across the Capitol and the Senate are on the cusp of passing a bipartisan VAWA reauthorization bill that contains these provisions to strengthen our ability to combat not only domestic violence but also sexual assault, dating violence, and stalking. And I'm so proud to say that right here on this floor 1 month ago, I introduced a companion bill to the Senate legislation that contains these badly needed updates to reflect the numerous stakeholders and lays a path forward for violence. The vision to protect all victims, no matter what their gender, sexual orientation, immigration status, or whether or not they reside in sovereign territories or in states. Now, these updates have garnered criticism for our colleagues on the other side of the aisle that offer fundamental, simple rights that ought to be guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. For example, this bill would recognize the tribe's authority to prosecute non-Indians or Indians who abuse their American Indian spouses or dating partners on tribal lands. 52% of women who are beaten, battered, raped, or stalked on tribal lands are not prosecuted because tribes have no authority, and on tribal lands there's no follow-up and no prosecution. The bill would also provide equal opportunity to services for traditionally underserved communities, including those who have barriers because of their religion, gender identity, or sexual orientation. It's absurd to say that because you are a homosexual that you don't deserve protection from being beaten or stalked or raped. And of course, the Hippocratic Oath would have us scoop up a person who may be lying in the street, hit by a truck. We don't ask people for their immigration papers in order to intervene in a life-saving intervention. Why would we demand this of immigrant women? We have got to ensure a more comprehensive response to the continuing problem of enforcement, reporting, and services for victims of sexual assault. Now, in spite of the strides we've made toward a new and improved VAWA, just yesterday, the House Republicans put their so-called clean reauthorization bill on the floor. And let me tell you this, it's clean perhaps because we don't want to sully our hands dealing with the beaten, stalked, murdered, and bullied butch batterers, which we don't want to deal with homosexuality. We want a clean reauthorization, a sleight of hand that keeps immigrant women in the shadows and keeps their pain and their battery and their victimization in the shadows and makes them invisible. And we are actually sanctioning the abuse that occurs on tribal lands and providing a sanctuary for assailants who commit these crimes on native lands by not providing this authority to tribal nations. I urge urge my Republican colleagues to work together with House Democrats to craft a truly bipartisan update of VAWA. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I thank you for your indulgence, and I yield back.